Nobody saw this coming, at least not at first. When the documentary was first mentioned, it sounded like just another ambitious move from 50 Cent. And honestly, that wouldn't have been surprising. He's built an entire second career out of turning real-life tension into compelling, cinematic storytelling. From music to television, he understands one thing better than most. People don't just watch stories, they watch conflict. At the beginning, this project felt like more of the same. Another gritty, industry-centered narrative. Another deep dive into the realities behind hip-hop. Nothing unusual. But then something shifted. It started quietly. A few whispers online, subtle reactions, comments that didn't seem important at first, but didn't quite sit right either. Then came the silence. And in today's internet culture, silence is rarely empty. It usually means something is building. Suddenly, one name turned into three. 50 Cent, T.I. Boosie Badazz. Now the conversation wasn't just about a documentary anymore. It was about connections, timing, and intent. Because in hip-hop, timing is never random. Fans began noticing something strange. Old clips resurfaced. Interviews from years ago started circulating again. Moments that had long faded from public attention were suddenly back in the spotlight, and people started asking the same question. Why now? That's when speculation exploded. Some fans believe this isn't just coincidence. They think there's a deeper layer behind the scenes, a calculated shift in narrative, not a loud public diss, not an obvious confrontation, something quieter, something strategic. And that's exactly what made it more intriguing. Because 50 Cent doesn't just tell stories, he curates them. Over the years, he's transformed from a chart-dominating rapper into a full-fledged media architect. His projects aren't random. They're intentional. Every angle, every storyline, every moment included or excluded, it all serves a purpose. When he builds a documentary, it's rarely neutral. It's designed to provoke thought, spark debate, and most importantly, keep people talking. And right now, people are definitely talking. The speculation centers around whether this documentary might include moments that cast certain artists in an uncomfortable light, particularly Boosie Badazz. Moments that weren't meant to resurface. Moments that could shift how audiences perceive past events. That's where things get complicated. Because once fans started connecting those resurfaced clips to the documentary, another theory emerged. Was T.I. somehow influencing the narrative? There's no confirmed evidence, no verified communication, nothing concrete. But in the world of hip-hop, and especially on the internet, possibility is enough to fuel a full-blown narrative. To understand why this theory caught fire so quickly, you have to look at the history between these figures. Start with 50 Cent. He's not just an artist anymore. He's a storyteller with power. Over the past decade, he's mastered the art of controlling perception. Through television, film, and documentaries, he's learned how to frame real-life events in ways that keep audiences engaged and invested. He understands controversy. More importantly, he understands how to use it. Then there's T.I. For years, he's positioned himself as a voice of authority in hip-hop, an elder statesman of Southern rap. He's articulate, thoughtful, and never afraid to speak on industry issues. Whether it's street codes, legal matters, or cultural debates, T.I. has consistently made his opinions known. Sometimes those opinions align with others, sometimes they don't. And that's where Boosie Badazz enters the picture. Boosie represents something entirely different. He's raw, unfiltered, and unapologetically honest. He doesn't shape his words for public approval, and that's exactly why people listen to him. His interviews alone have sparked headlines for years. But that same honesty has also led to tension. In the past, Boosie and T.I. have had public disagreements. Not explosive, headline-dominating feuds, but real, noticeable friction. Their differences weren't just personal, they were philosophical. They disagreed on how situations should be handled, on what loyalty looks like, on what should and shouldn't be said publicly. At one point, Boosie openly criticized T.I. over comments related to legal matters involving other artists. T.I. responded, "It wasn't friendly, it wasn't playful, it was tense." Eventually, things cooled down, or at least appeared to. But in hip-hop, nothing really disappears, it just waits. So when 50 Cent begins teasing a documentary centered around industry controversies and sensitive topics, fans immediately start scanning for familiar storylines. And when those storylines overlap with unresolved tension, speculation becomes inevitable. Because here's the truth about hip-hop documentaries today. They don't just tell history, they reshape it. They decide which moments matter, which perspectives get highlighted, which narratives take center stage. And when an old conflict suddenly reappears in a major project, people don't assume coincidence, they assume intention. Now, to be clear, there is no confirmed proof that T.I. had any involvement in shaping this documentary. No evidence of private conversations, no direct link. But perception doesn't rely on proof. It relies on patterns. And fans started seeing patterns everywhere. Old Boosie clips resurfacing, conversations being revived, the timing aligning with 50 Cent's project rollout. It all felt deliberate. Was it? Or is this just another example of how quickly the internet connects dots, whether they belong together or not? That's the question no one can answer definitively. But there's another layer to consider. 50 Cent has built a reputation for not avoiding uncomfortable moments. If anything, he leans into them. If a scene sparks conversation, he'll use it. If a narrative creates tension, he'll amplify it. That's part of his formula. So if this documentary does include controversial moments involving Boosie or anyone else, it wouldn't necessarily mean there's a hidden alliance or agenda. It could simply mean the story itself demands it. Still, fans aren't convinced it's that simple. Because when you look at the relationships involved, things get more interesting. 50 Cent and T.I. have had a complex dynamic over the years, publicly respectful but historically competitive. Both are leaders in their own right. Both have strong personalities. Both understand influence. Meanwhile, Boosie doesn't share that same kind of connection with 50 Cent. So when people start imagining behind-the-scenes dynamics, they naturally begin theorizing alliances. Not because they're confirmed, but because hip-hop culture has always been shaped by alliances, rivalries, and shifting loyalties. And that brings us to the bigger picture. The modern era of hip-hop documentaries isn't just about storytelling, it's about legacy. Artists aren't just documenting the past anymore. They're shaping how that past will be remembered. They're adding context, redefining narratives, and in some cases, reclaiming control over their own stories. Because in the end, whoever tells the story controls the perception. So maybe this documentary isn't just about controversy. Maybe it's about positioning. Maybe it's about influence. Or maybe it's exactly what it appears to be, a carefully crafted story designed to spark conversation, whether the speculation is real or not. Either way, one thing is certain. The conversation isn't slowing down anytime soon. This is where everything changes. Because when someone like 50 Cent controls the production lens, the stakes aren't just high, they're strategic. Documentaries don't simply present facts, they frame them. And framing is powerful because it shapes how people remember events long after the moment has passed. So when certain clips, especially controversial ones, start resurfacing, it doesn't feel random. Even if they're pulled from old archives, even if they've existed for years, the timing makes them feel intentional. And that's where social media steps in and turns curiosity into momentum. It starts with a simple question: Why is Boosie Badazz being highlighted right now? Then another. Why bring this back now? And then the one that really fuels everything. Is this strategic? Once those questions hit timelines, the narrative begins to snowball. Fans start digging. Old interviews resurface. Instagram lives from years ago get reposted. Past disagreements are pulled out of context and re-examined under a completely new lens. And just like that, the rumor grows legs. Not because anyone confirmed anything dramatic, not because there's proof of some hidden agenda, but because the history was already there. The tension already existed, and when tension exists, it doesn't take much to bring it back to life. Here's the psychological twist that makes all of this even more compelling. Audiences are more drawn to quiet, behind-the-scenes drama than loud, public conflict. A diss track, that's obvious. A direct confrontation, easy to understand. But a subtle shift in narrative, that feels calculated. And calculation is always more intriguing than chaos. So when whispers started suggesting that certain clips might present Boosie in an uncomfortable or even misleading way, fans didn't just see content, they saw a move. Whether that perception is accurate or not doesn't even matter at that point, because perception drives conversation. Now look at the setup. You have 50 Cent, a media-savvy powerhouse who understands exactly how to shape narratives. You have T.I., an outspoken industry veteran with a history of speaking on controversial topics and clashing philosophically with others. And you have Boosie Badazz, raw, unfiltered, and known for saying exactly what he thinks, regardless of how it's received. Add timing, add history, add speculation, and suddenly the story starts writing itself. But this is where things really heat up. Because when old tension meets modern media platforms, escalation isn't just possible, it's inevitable. And that's exactly what happened next. The temperature shifted, not because new evidence surfaced, not because anyone confirmed a hidden agenda, but because the internet collectively decided that something felt intentional. Once fans began connecting the rollout of 50 Cent's documentary with resurfaced clips of Boosie, the conversation stopped being casual. It became strategic. Clips started circulating again, Boosie speaking passionately, doubling down on his views, refusing to soften his stance. But now, those same clips were being interpreted differently. What was once seen as raw honesty was now being labeled as reckless. What was once unfiltered became, in some discussions, a liability. And that subtle shift in framing changed everything. Because perception doesn't change on its own, it changes when context changes. The moment those clips started trending alongside the anticipation of a major documentary, fans began asking deeper questions. Why these clips? Why now? Who benefits from this spotlight? And that's when T.I. gets pulled back into the conversation. Because people remember. They remember the past disagreements between T.I. and Boosie. Not explosive feuds, but sharp, philosophical differences about loyalty, industry ethics, and public accountability. So when those memories resurface alongside new speculation, the theories intensify. Is T.I. influencing the narrative? Is this documentary subtly reframing Boosie's past statements? Or is the internet simply connecting dots that don't actually belong together? That uncertainty is what makes the situation so powerful. Because here's the truth. There is no verified proof of behind-the-scenes coordination. No confirmed footage being passed around. No direct evidence of anyone shaping the narrative in secret. But hip-hop culture has always thrived on perceived alliances.
King of the South, artist Moneybagg Yo, also did interviews discussing the Miss Jackson record, explaining his perspective on how.
Then came the moment that pushed everything even further. A teaser from 50 Cent's project dropped, featuring a single line. Public words can come back to define you. No names, no direct shots, just a statement. But that was enough. Fans immediately linked it to Boosie's long history of headline-making interviews. And just like that, the narrative evolved.
He suggested that T might face questions about reported legal allegations that have been discussed publicly.
And it was about consequences. And in hip-hop, that word carries weight. Because reputation is everything. If a documentary reframes past statements in a way that shifts public perception, even slightly, it can impact how an artist's legacy is viewed moving forward. That possibility made people uneasy. Supporters of Boosie pushed back, arguing, "He's always been real. That's not embarrassing, that's authenticity." Others countered, "Being authentic doesn't mean you're immune from criticism." Now the conversation wasn't just about footage. It became philosophical. But here's where things took an even more interesting turn. Silence. Neither T.I. nor Boosie directly addressed the rumors. And in this context, silence speaks volumes. Because when something is completely false, it often gets shut down quickly. But when it's unclear, when it sits in that gray area, people wait. And waiting builds suspense. Meanwhile, 50 Cent did exactly what he's known for. He teased. Cryptic captions, short promotional lines, perfectly timed posts. Nothing explicit, but just enough to keep people talking. And every time he posted, the same question flooded the comments. Is this about Boosie? That's the strategy. Because 50 Cent understands something most people overlook. Speculation is free marketing. He doesn't need to make direct accusations. He doesn't need to confirm anything. The audience does the work for him. They analyze. They debate. They amplify. And whether intentional or not, the tension fuels attention. Then the narrative shifted again, from rumor to rivalry. Fan pages began posting side-by-side graphics. 50 Cent, T.I., Boosie, with captions like, "Who controls the narrative?" And that's the real conflict here. Not humiliation, not hidden footage, narrative control. Because whoever frames the story controls how it's remembered. Now imagine being Boosie in this moment. You see old clips of yourself trending again. You see debates about whether those clips make you look reckless. You see your name tied to a project you didn't create and don't control. Even if nothing malicious is happening, it feels uncomfortable. Because once the footage leaves your hands, so does the interpretation. And that's the core tension here. Not loud, not explosive, but subtle and potentially more impactful because of it. Then came a moment that quietly intensified everything. During a live appearance, a fan asked Boosie about the documentary rumors. He didn't lash out. He didn't accuse anyone. He simply said, "Everybody got their version." That line stuck because it acknowledges something deeper. It suggests awareness that stories can be told in different ways. That truth isn't always about what happened, but how it's presented. And once that idea took hold, the conversation shifted again. Now people weren't asking, "Is there embarrassing footage?" They were asking, "Whose version of the story are we about to see?" And that question is far more powerful. Because this was never really about embarrassment. It's about legacy. And once legacy becomes part of the conversation, the tension doesn't fade. It evolves. Now the stage is fully set, and this is where things begin to feel less like speculation and more like strategy. Because here's the reality. If the documentary drops and includes moments that feel pointed, moments that seem carefully chosen to highlight tension. Then the conversation won't just continue, it will explode. And if it does, then what we've witnessed becomes something just as powerful, a masterclass in how anticipation and speculation alone can generate massive attention. Either way, the tension has already done its job. And we're not even at the release yet. This is the moment where everything shifts from gossip to positioning. At first, it was just fan pages connecting dots, screenshots, reposted clips, theories bouncing around timelines. But once the speculation reached a certain level, the conversation evolved. Now, industry voices stepped in. Podcast hosts started debating the ethics of documentary storytelling. Media commentators began asking deeper questions. Is it fair to spotlight old controversial statements without updated context? Is that honest storytelling or strategic editing? Is this about documenting history or shaping perception? And once those questions entered the conversation, one thing became clear. When 50 Cent produces something, nothing about it is accidental. He understands angles. He understands pacing. He understands emotional timing. Most importantly, he understands that tension keeps people watching. And just when the conversation seemed to settle, another teaser dropped. No names, no direct shots, just a single line. Loyalty shifts when the cameras turn off. That was enough. Because in hip-hop, you don't always need direct statements. Subtext carries just as much weight, sometimes more. Fans immediately connected that line to the past tension between T.I. and Boosie Badazz. And that's where things escalated again. Because their history wasn't built on explosive beef, it was built on layered disagreement. They've clashed over perspectives, over industry ethics, over how certain situations should be handled publicly. Boosie spoke openly. T.I. responded thoughtfully, but firmly. The moment cooled, but it never fully disappeared. So when a documentary teaser starts referencing loyalty, perspective, and what happens behind the scenes, fans don't hear a generic message. They hear implication. And implication is where escalation lives. But here's the twist that makes this situation more complex than it first appears. The real reveal isn't about secret footage. It's not about hidden agendas. It's about something far more powerful. Memory. Audience memory is fragile. And documentaries have the power to reshape it. If past moments are presented with new commentary, new tone, or new emotional framing, they can feel completely different, especially to younger audiences who didn't experience those events in real time. That's the real tension here. Not embarrassment. Interpretation. Because for an artist like Boosie, whose entire identity is built on unapologetic honesty, context is everything. Tone matters. Editing matters. Presentation matters. A clip shown without full context can shift perception instantly. And once perception shifts, it starts building a new version of legacy. At the same time, T.I. brings a different energy into the equation. He's often viewed as reflective, calculated, and strategic in how he communicates. If the documentary includes perspectives that align more closely with his past viewpoints, audiences may subconsciously see that as validation. Not because anything was orchestrated, but because narrative framing influences emotion. And emotion influences belief. Then came another moment that pushed the conversation even further. A hip-hop blog dropped a headline. Is this documentary quietly rewriting
You might want to
old
consider
beef?
bringing in a crisis PR
It didn't
team,
accuse
with many
anyone
fans debating
directly.
whether
It didn't claim there was hidden footage or manipulation. But it asked the one question that matters most in media. Who benefits from how this story is told? That question spread fast. Because in storytelling, Especially documentary storytelling, framing is everything. Now imagine the scenario everyone is anticipating. The documentary releases. It includes archived clips of Boosie speaking openly, unfiltered, passio, Nate and direct. Then those clips are placed alongside commentary about controversy, consequences, or public reaction. Even if the editing is technically neutral, the emotional weight shifts. And that's the power of storytelling. Because storytelling isn't just about what's shown, it's about how it feels when it's shown. And 50 Cent understands that better than almost anyone in the space. Now let's break down the psychology behind what's happening. When fans feel like an artist's image might be unfairly shifted, they react. They defend. They push back. And that's exactly what started happening. Supporters of Boosie began speaking out. He's always been real. Don't twist his words. That's not embarrassing, that's honesty. On the other side, critics responded. Being real doesn't mean you avoid consequences. Public statements have public impact. Suddenly, the conversation wasn't about clips anymore. It became about accountability. And accountability debates run deeper than drama. They touch identity. They force people to pick sides, not just between artists, but between values. And that's why this moment feels bigger than a typical hip-hop rumor. Because here's the truth. There is no confirmed alliance, no verified exchange of footage, no proof of behind-the-scenes coordination. But the possibility of narrative alignment between powerful figures is enough to create tension. Because documentaries are permanent. Instagram lives disappear. Tweets get deleted. Interviews fade. But documentaries, they stay. They live on streaming platforms for years. They become reference points. And in hip-hop, reference points matter. They shape how future audiences understand past events. So even the idea that a documentary might spotlight uncomfortable moments can feel threatening. Not because of embarrassment, but because of legacy. And in hip-hop culture, legacy protection is serious. That's when the energy shifted again. Boosie was asked again about the speculation. This time his response was calm, controlled, direct. I ain't worried about nobody telling stories. I lived mine. That line hit because it carried confidence. And confidence changes perception. It doesn't deny anything. It doesn't confirm anything. It simply reclaims ownership. And ownership neutralizes the idea of humiliation. Meanwhile, 50 Cent continued doing what he does best. Posting, teasing, dropping just enough to keep the conversation alive, without ever saying too much. No direct names. No confirmations. Just calculated ambiguity. And T.I. completely unbothered publicly. No responses. No engagement with the speculation. Which, ironically, made everything feel even louder. Because sometimes, silence creates more intrigue than any statement ever could. And now we've reached the most interesting point in all of this. The documentary hasn't even been released yet. But the narrative around it is already intense. That's influence. That's power. And that's why this situation feels bigger than just rumor or resurfaced clips. It feels like a chessboard. Every post, every teaser, every resurfaced interview, even every moment of silence, it all feels like a move, whether intentional or not. And now, the only thing left is the release. Because that's when speculation meets reality. And we find out whether this was just a perfectly timed storm, or something much more deliberate. By this point, the conversation had outgrown rumor blogs entirely. What started as scattered speculation had now evolved into something much bigger. It moved into podcasts. It took over Twitter Spaces. It became a topic in marketing panels and media discussions. Because when names like 50 Cent, T.I., and Boosie Badazz appear in the same narrative, even hypothetically, people pay attention. Not just fans, industry insiders, media strategists, brand managers, cultural commentators. Now the conversation wasn't about whether humiliating footage existed. It had evolved into something far more significant. What does this documentary actually represent? Because here's the part most viewers don't consciously think about. Documentaries are power plays. They don't just capture culture, they shape it. And when someone like 50 Cent produces a project, it doesn't just enter the conversation, it becomes part of the archive, a timestamp, a reference point, a version of events that future audiences may accept as definitive. That's why the reaction became so layered. Supporters of Boosie didn't wait for the release, they moved early. Threads began circulating online defending his past interviews. Fans reposted full-length clips, making sure context stayed intact. It wasn't just support, it felt like preemptive protection. One viral post summed it up perfectly. Don't take 10 seconds out of a 30-minute conversation. That line captured the fear, not of exposure, but of distortion. At the same time, neutral observers started zooming out and asking a much bigger question. Are we entering an era where artists compete through storytelling instead of diss tracks? That question hit differently. Because historically, conflict in hip-hop meant music, diss tracks, freestyles, direct lyrical confrontation. Now, it could mean documentaries. It could mean narrative framing. It could mean controlling how history is remembered rather than how it's responded to in real time. That's not just evolution, that's a shift in power. And the industry noticed. Marketing professionals began quietly praising 50 Cent's rollout strategy, not by confirming any rumors, but by acknowledging the effectiveness of the moment. One analyst said it clearly on a podcast. He understands how to build anticipation through tension. That statement didn't accuse, it reframed. This wasn't chaos. This was strategy. Meanwhile, T.I.'s silence became its own storyline. Because he's not someone known for staying quiet. He's articulate, thoughtful, and usually willing to engage in conversations about industry dynamics. So when he didn't respond, people noticed. Was he intentionally staying out of it? Was there nothing to address? Or was the internet projecting connections that didn't exist? The absence of an answer only made the question louder. On the other side, Boosie's approach was different. Confidence. No panic, no defensive interviews, no attempts to control the narrative publicly. Just a steady message. He stands on what he said. That alone shifted the tone. Because humiliation requires visible discomfort. And discomfort never appeared. Instead of looking defensive, Boosie looked grounded. And that matters. Because perception isn't just shaped by what's said, it's shaped by how people carry themselves in the middle of speculation. Then something interesting happened. The conversation stopped being dramatic and became philosophical. Hip-hop commentators began asking deeper questions. Should documentaries reopen old wounds? Is it fair to revisit controversial statements years later? Or is that part of cultural accountability? These aren't simple debates. They tap into generational divides within hip-hop itself. Older audiences often argue that context matters more than modern interpretation, that you can't judge past statements without understanding the time they were made. Younger audiences often see it differently. They argue that impact outweighs intent. That words, regardless of when they were said, carry consequences. And documentaries sit right in the middle of that tension. They don't just present the past. They reinterpret it for the present. Now step into the psychology of why this rumor spread so quickly. Humans are wired to anticipate conflict. We're drawn to it. The idea that powerful figures might be subtly shaping narratives behind the scenes, it feels cinematic. It feels like strategy. It feels like something bigger than what's visible. And in a world flooded with content, audiences crave stakes, even if those stakes are speculative. That's what made this moment different. The focus shifted. It wasn't about, is there embarrassing footage? It became about legacy protection. Artists protecting their story. Producers shaping narrative arcs. Fans defending reputations. And once legacy enters the conversation, everything feels heavier. Because legacy isn't temporary. It's permanent. Now here's the part no one says out loud, but everyone understands. If the documentary drops and Boosie's moments are presented neutrally, then this entire situation becomes proof of how hype can build itself. But if those same moments feel emphasized, framed in a way that shifts perception, then the narrative evolves again. Either way, 50 Cent wins. From a marketing standpoint, it's simple. Attention creates engagement. Engagement creates viewership. Viewership creates cultural relevance. That's the formula. And right now, every piece of it is working. But the audience didn't stay one-sided. Some fans defended 50 Cent. He tells stories. If it happened publicly, it's fair game. Others pushed back. There's a difference between storytelling and framing. And that's where the entire debate landed. Framing, because framing determines tone, and tone determines perception. Now step back again and look at the bigger picture. No public feud erupted. No direct confrontation happened. No official accusations were made. And yet the conversation felt intense. Why? Because speculation layered on top of real history creates something powerful. History gave this story friction. Friction made it believable. And believability fuels virality. Now we're at a critical point. The documentary hasn't even fully aired yet. But expectations have already been shaped. Which means when it finally releases, audiences won't watch it passively. They'll watch it actively, looking for meaning, looking for emphasis, looking for who is framed in what way. And once viewers watch through that lens, everything becomes amplified. A pause feels intentional. An edit feels strategic. A clip feels load. That's the real shift in power. The audience is no longer neutral. They're primed. And primed audiences interpret emotionally. Now we enter the final phase. Because once legacy, narrative control, and perception collide, there's only one question left. What happens next? Here's where everything tightens. The documentary still hasn't fully dropped. There's no confirmed humiliating footage. No verified behind-the-scenes coordination. And yet, the narrative already feels heavy. Why? Because anticipation has already shaped perception. When 50 Cent releases the full trailer, people aren't casually watching. They're analyzing. They're studying tone. They're looking for subtext. They're asking, who is this really about? Then comes the unexpected twist. The trailer isn't narrow. It's expansive. It includes archival clips from multiple artists, industry commentary, heated debates, outspoken interviews across different eras. It's bigger than anyone predicted. It's not centered on one person. not built around one narrative. But here's the catch. Because speculation had already centered around Boosie, every moment he appears feels amplified. Every clip gets scrutinized. Every reaction gets dissected. Every edit gets questioned. Not because the content demands it, but because the audience expects it. That's what priming does. It reshapes how we see what's in front of us. And that leads to the final realization. The story was never really about humiliation. It was about vulnerability. Because when your past words, your interviews, your opinions all get pulled into a new narrative framework, you lose a level of control. Not over what you said, but over how it's understood. And for artists whose identities are built on authenticity, that's the real tension. Not being exposed, but being reinterpreted. Because in the end, this isn't just about a documentary. It's about who gets to define the story. The person who lived it, or the person who tells it. This is where everything comes full circle, and where the real meaning of this entire moment starts to reveal itself. Because once a documentary is released, something irreversible happens. The story leaves the artist's hands. And that's the part people don't always think about. When moments get archived, especially in a high-profile project led by someone like 50 Cent, they don't just exist anymore, they solidify. They become reference points. They become part of how history is remembered. And once that happens, control shifts. Even if the editing is fair, even if the storytelling is balanced, the emotional impact can land completely differently, especially when audiences are already expecting tension. That expectation changes everything. Meanwhile, T.I. remains exactly where he's been this entire time, composed. No reactions, no subtle jabs, no attempts to insert himself into the conversation. Just silence. And that silence does something interesting. It shapes everything that comes after. That's the real power of storytelling. And that's why this moment matters.